Good morning and welcome to the Daily Cyber Briefing for Wednesday, the 16th of April. I'm Stephen Ridgway. So here's an interesting one. There is a critical Chrome vulnerability that exposes users to data theft and unauthorized access. Okay, nothing new there. Chrome patches itself, doesn't it, and keeps itself up to date. Well, this is very curious. Yesterday, Chrome said, the usual relaunch to update, which I did. Didn't bother looking at where I was or where I ended up because, like probably everybody else on the planet, Chrome just says, well, there's a patch, relaunch, and you'll be fine. So I did. I've relaunched, and there is no longer a relaunch to update notification in Chrome. So this morning, whilst doing some research around what's kicked off overnight that might be interesting to talk to you about, critical Chrome vulnerability came up, and I thought, oh, that's probably the one then that got patched yesterday when Chrome asked for the restart to apply the patch. So I thought, just out of curiosity. Let's have a quick look at what the versions are. And so the version which they are saying has been patched is 135.0. So they've got a horrible numbering scheme, haven't they? .7049.95 or .96 for Windows and Mac, and .95 for Linux. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder whether I'm already there. So I went to have a look at the version of Chrome that was running in my particular browser, and it says, oh, you are nearly up to date. Relaunch Chrome to finish updating. The version I'm on is .85 with a relaunch button. So if you query Chrome, as in go to About Chrome, it says, oh, you need a relaunch in order to finish getting up to date. But it's not sitting there in the top right-hand corner with the relaunch Chrome in order to apply patches notification, which I don't know whether you can turn off, but I certainly haven't gone along and deliberately turned off. So, salutary warning. Even if Chrome is not saying it needs to be updated, you should occasionally manually check to see whether there is an update pending. Because this surprised me. I don't recall ever actually having to go in and look. And for a very long time, I've not manually, gone off and tried to update Chrome because it just updates itself, and it seemed to be very much on top of it. But the fact that it's sitting there needing to be relaunched in order to apply an update, but it hasn't told me through the mechanism it normally uses to tell me, probably means that there's a whole load of you out there that are sitting in the same situation. Lesson learned. Every now and then, pop into Chrome, especially if there are articles, which I will most likely be talking about in the daily briefing. If there are vulnerabilities that are known, manually go and check and make sure that your Chrome version is up to date. It's not just WordPress that sits there saying, well, I'm vulnerable, but I won't update myself. To other matters, we have long been of the opinion that during ransomware attacks, one of the key files or key pieces of information that attackers look for is your cyber insurance policy. I haven't previously seen very much being discussed in cyber or mainstream press about this, but the logic behind it is, well, if you've got cyber insurance, you're much more likely to pay a ransom, so that makes you a more interesting target than an organization that doesn't have cyber insurance, that will feel much more much more likely to deal with the ransomware incident themselves rather than pay the ransom. I mean, these days you've got to think about this. You're not paying the ransom to get your data back, because unless you're completely bonkers, you can't trust anything that's been fiddled with by an attacker, encrypted and then decrypted all by an attacker. How do you know that anything there is still in a state which is safe to use? The answer is you just shouldn't. You can't trust it, so you shouldn't use it. So from a technical recovery perspective, rebuild, restore, these are the sorts of things that are required. You might be paying a ransom in order to hope that your data doesn't get leaked. But you might also consider all sorts of other completely hopeless methods of making sure. I don't know. You can just how on earth would you? They were criminals, right? So they're criminals that have nicked your data and have said, "Pay us lots of money, and we won't release the data." It's like, well, I couldn't trust you not to nick the data in the first place. Why do I trust you to keep my data safe? Now you've nicked it. So the logic behind paying a ransom is, I think, just completely stupid. But there we go. However, if your insurance company is paying, it's not your money. So you might as well get your insurance company to pay it, because, well, what the hell? But it might delay the leak. It might prevent the leak. It might prevent the leak. You can't guarantee it'll prevent the leak, whatever you do, but it might prevent the leak for a bit. At least until the attacking group feels like selling your data to somebody else that will then leak it. So there is an interesting article in the Register that talks about exactly this point, that the ransom that is being demanded depends on whether organizations are known to have cyber insurance or not. So one of the first things that an attacking group is doing is searching around to see can they find cyber insurance documentation. Now, they talk a lot in the article about generics and averages, about the sizes of payouts and all of this, that, and the other. I think in my experience, the maximum payout is going to be determined in your insurance policy. So there you are, there's a guaranteed amount of money that, as an attacker, you think you're going to get. So the amount that will be asked for will very much be influenced by the amount that your insurance company has declared you're covered for. So it isn't just a sort of random average. I think there are some other interesting statistics in this particular article. So ransomware operators obviously are increasing the ransom demand by a factor of something like more or less 3 times more if you've got cyber insurance. But I bet you that's not just there's insurance, we'll up it by 3 times. It'll be a case of, there's insurance, let's see how much they're covered for, right, we'll go for that. And the discrepancy then is down to what's being covered. It does talk about the fact that 44% of insured organizations appear to pay out, whereas 24% of the uninsured organizations pay out. The insured organizations, they're saying, are paying on average 600,000 to deal with a ransomware event, whereas uninsured are actually paying around 110,000 to deal with paying the ransom. So that I think is very interesting. It is. They are sort of broad industry averages, but it gives you a ballpark figure for how much money is involved in these sorts of things. So the actual payout via insurance is significantly higher, so 6 times higher than regardless of what's being demanded, the actual payout is kind of 6 times higher than for insured customers than uninsured customers. That in itself makes an insured customer a much more lucrative target for attackers than an uninsured organization. So I would not be surprised if the insurance industry cottons onto this pretty rapidly. If it's now hit, if it's hit cyber press, so it would only take a little leap to go as kind of into the mainstream press, and then everybody is going to be aware of this fact. Cyber insurance, I expect there to be changes, expect there to be more in the way of exclusions, expect there to be fewer payouts. I would suspect that this will more general change in the approach to how cyber insurance is used, is seen as being a reason for not bothering with much else in the way of cyber protections. So yeah, very interesting. I think something that we all need to be aware of. And then finally from me, you've probably heard it elsewhere, but as part of cost savings in the US, CISA has ceased or is just about to cease funding MITRE to run the CVE program, CVE database. Without getting overly political, I think there may well be a good argument for reducing federal spending. I think most Western governments carry a lot of bloat and a great deal of expense, which holds back investment and innovation and growth in the real part of the economy, not the public sector cost to the economy, but the actual generating part of the economy. Personal view, you may disagree. However, there are things that I think that government should do. There are things which are done inefficiently if done multiple times by individual organizations. And I think a good example of that would be, let's say, national defense. Okay, you could say, no, the government should not invest any money into defense at all. If you want to defend yourself, go and raise your own army. Well, in theory, you could do that. And if you look back in history, a few hundred years ago, individual landowning barons would have the rights to raise their own armies and defend themselves against anybody that, whatever. They would have an obligation, I think, to provide troops to the king, but if they didn't want to, they could go to war with him instead. So, whatever it is. So it can be done another way. It wasn't done very well, though. And that's why we've ended up with something like, defense spending being central. Where does cybersecurity fit in this arena? Well, I think there is an argument. If you look back to, I forget now how long, it's been about 25 years, I think, that the CVE program has been running. And I've certainly been in this game long enough to remember what it was like before that. And it was confusing. And the reason it was confusing is that in individual vulnerabilities end up being tracked under different names by different groups. So let's take an example of something that might be relevant to most of us here. Let's say, a vulnerability in a Linux component. Okay, the package or the whoever maintainers for that particular component may not be the people that find the vulnerability. So let's say that the vulnerability is found by somebody in the Red Hat world, and they name it something so that you can track it. Well, that's often used to turn into that being tracked, something in Red Hat and something else in Debian and something else in Ubuntu and so on. So you end up with what's effectively the same vulnerability under multiple names. Knowing whether you've been patched or whether all of your systems have been patched against that particular vulnerability becomes much harder to track. You have many places you need to go in order to find out whether the vulnerability that you think you're patching is the same one that is referred to in other things. And especially with something like Linux, where there are the individual distros, but then there are also vendor specific forks of distros that for example, Cisco use in some of their tooling. Well, they'll have their own way of tracking it. So you can see you end up it ends up becoming very difficult to know whether the vulnerabilities that you see being announced actually are relevant for things that you actually have. So CVE was a brilliant idea. Yes, I know it's got its problems, and I know it's far from perfect, but it's certainly, if you're looking at like that sort of 80-20 Pareto rule of if you deal with 80% of stuff properly, you can do that without using up so much in the way of time and effort and resources that the last 20%. Well, if you can't get that right, it's probably it is significant. It is less impactful to you. So CVE tracking vulnerabilities globally as CVEs is a good thing. I do wonder whether pulling funding for something like this comes from a philosophy of if it's useful, somebody should be paying for it. Which, given the current regime in US, wouldn't surprise me. However, I think what is likely to happen over the next few months is, unless the industry steps up or unless there's a change of heart in government funding of CISA, we will end up in a situation where vulnerabilities are not being tracked and managed and mitigated, patched, or whatever in a timely manner. So we will see an impact on trade, and we will see an impact on real organisations in the real world, real life. What's it called? In real life, as my daughters would say. So yeah, I think this is one to keep an eye on. It's part of a general reduction in the useful stuff in cyber that it appears that the US federal government is prepared to fund. I think that's to the detriment of the whole of the West, and I think that personally think that the longer term outcomes of not doing these things well will be bad. But there we go, personal opinion, rant over. So hope you have a good Wednesday, and I'll speak to you all